I paid her to say that.
This is not something that we just made up on a whim. Looks at Eric.
Was that a good thing that happened?
Produced some of the greatest music ever.
You're just another cog. Something called Zionism.
2024 is the year to watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Hi everyone, welcome to the club. Thank you for watching today's video. Today, as you can see, I am here with some of my friends. I would just like to take a moment to thank them all for being here today, because this is new territory for all of us, including myself. This is not something that I've really done on my channel before. It has been a wish list item that has not yet happened until today. So I'm really happy to be here today with everyone. Today's video is going to be about some Star Trek things and some real life things. So let's introduce our lineup, I guess is the correct word for it. So if you are new here, you may or may not have been on my channel before. My name is Jazi Cat. I am a streamer and a video creator and your hottest pink idol. I also am the leader of Pink Squadron in Star Trek Online, and you can find me on my Twitch channel mostly weekly at JazzyCatXOX. Who wants to go next? Eric?
Hello, my name is Dr. Eric Denslow, PhD. I have extensive expertise in early Christianity, into the Levant area, also into Mesopotamia. I also have a master's degree in divinity and also in ancient history. So I think that I pretty much have this this area of this discussion pretty wrapped up pretty well here.
Hello, my name is Joe Coleflesh, and I don't really have credentials the way Dr. Denslow has, but I love Star Trek. I love talking about it. I love watching it. And I'm here tonight because primarily I was told this was going to be catered, but it's not.
Look, if you wanted catering, you had to ask way before now.
I jest.
Well, don't sell yourself short. You are here because you are an expert on Star Trek.
Yeah, my name's Emily. I just finished Deep Space Nine a couple weeks ago and really loved the show, so I'm excited to be here to talk about it.
Yay, our resident newbie.
Yeah, you should get an award for that.
I did want to also point out as well that we are highlighting many different perspectives and generations along this lineup. I mean, we have myself, and I mean, me and Emily are close to the same age, but these two are not. We have a wide range of perspectives here, so I just thought that was really exciting and interesting because I think there's a perception that, you know, we can't find common ground between the generations, and here we have found some of it, hopefully.
I think it's definitely a misnomer, especially from what I see, especially when I'm teaching my students, this idea that there has to be this wall brought up between different generations, whereas I see so many of the young generation, especially the Gen Zers or the millennials, that really connect very well with us Gen Xers. I think that drawing walls between each other is kind of a disservice when it really comes down to it.
It is weird for sure. It's just that I wanted to highlight that we're all sitting here together and we're all, you know, friends and we get along. You know, on more than just Star Trek, you know, we actually enjoy each other's company.
I paid her to say that.
Wouldn't still be in the club if I didn't.
Yeah, we're all in the same Star Trek club locally down here, so it's a good time. So to start out our actual discussion, I just kind of want to talk about and kind of ask everyone else as well, how we feel that Star Trek has guided our real life principles, just kind of from a general aspect. You don't have to go too into it because otherwise we'll be here all day. Because for me, Star Trek is not just science fiction. I believe that it is created to teach us about life and share different perspectives and knowledge and such. So I just want to pose that kind of to everyone else to share a little bit.
Well, from where I come from, especially in theology, we deal strictly in what we call the rational and irrational. And when I look into Star Trek, I see the same myth, the same dogma, and the same ideals that you will find in different faiths and religions. Different ways to tell a story, to basically bring about an understanding of different ideals, a way for everyone to meet in the middle and to understand that we're not really that different.
Well, for me, I'm multiracial. My mother's Japanese. My father was from the United States. And if you know anything about the Japanese culture, they're really into the full-blood, Japanese person. To be fully accepted into the family, into the culture, you have to be that. And I never was. Don't get me wrong, I was never treated bad. I never was. And my family loved me, and they, gave me all the things that I wanted as a little kid. But being multiracial, I understood Mr. Spock a lot better. I understood his challenges and his the things that he didn't do well. The interacting, he spoke over people. I don't do that, but I understood that, how I don't fit in completely. And for me, because of that, I wanted to be on the Starship Enterprise so I could go with Spock and we could go find that world where we do belong. And what I found out over the years, over the decades, for me, I'm the oldest one here on the panel, is that Star Trek, being on the ship itself is finding your home. That is being at home. And as the years have gone by, we're going to talk heavy about DS9 tonight. I love watching that show. I think of that space station out in the middle of somewhere, by the wormhole, by Cardassia, by Bajor. And, for me, that's a neat place to be because you see all of this menagerie of different ethnicities and races and beings. And for me, that's, made me feel comfortable. And that's why I love Star Trek.
I think the biggest thing Star Trek's, done for me in my life is I used to shy away from, new experiences or, feel a little worried if I was encountering a new perspective. And Star Trek really highlights you should seek out these new perspectives. You should seek out these new experiences. Going through Star Trek and kind of internalizing that has really improved my life in a lot of ways of seeking out and wanting to know things that are different than myself.
No, I would agree with that as well because, I didn't start because I didn't want to color anyone's perspectives, but I would have said something very similar as well, that for me, it's about that new stuff. And I think that if it had not been for me watching Star Trek from an early age, I think I would be a very different person and maybe not a great person because it's just a very unique franchise. And I know it might seem silly to some people to put this much weight into, one franchise, one piece of media, but there's so much to it. And, if you're on my channel and you haven't seen Star Trek, I would highly, highly recommend it. 2024 is the year to watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So today's video topic is kind of open-ended a little bit. We did kind of say that this is going to be about Deep Space Nine, and we do kind of want to make this eventually maybe a series. But today we wanted to really focus on, the current issues and stuff. So starting out with the real life influences on Deep Space Nine in general, I have some quotes here that I grabbed from Memory Alpha, and I did check the sources and everything and made sure everything was together. And as far as I could tell, it was. So because we're highlighting today the Cardassians and the Bajorans and that sort of, it's a huge topic, I know. We're not going to cover it all today, but we're covering the Cardassians and the Bajorans of Deep Space Nine and their conflict with each other in terms of the very real things that are happening in terms of Palestine and Israel. I wanted to share some quotes from some of the writers just to kind of emphasize that this is not something that we just made up on a whim. This is real stuff that the writers had in mind when they were writing this. And of course, this was in the 90s, and you couldn't have made Deep Space Nine today in a post-9/11 world. Who did this quote? So, as much as those who are familiar with my channel know that I have oftentimes roasted Rick Berman, and I do have a Rick Berman quote, so I'm a little bit sorry, but even a broken clock is right twice a day,
Get your helmet on and get in your foxhole, right?
So there was also Michael Piller, and I hope I'm saying names right. Sometimes I'm really bad with names. So this first quote is from Michael Piller, who had compared the Bajorans directly to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and also the Kurds and the Jews. and basically any racially bound group of people who have been deprived of their home by a powerful force. So that really stood out to me because it kind of shows that these are not specific concepts. These aren't unique just to this conflict or just to Deep Space Nine. This is a universal thing that unfortunately 30 years after the show was on, we're still dealing with, and it's very universal. And then here's the one from Rick Berman, who also compared them to the Kurds, the Palestinians, the Jews in the 1940s, the boat people from Haiti, and he also said, unfortunately, the homeless and terrorism are problems in every age, which was, I hate to give him credit.
But there is one thing that was happening in the 90s that a lot of people forget. And that was the horrible war that was happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. That was something that was serious. I actually served during it. And there was ethnic cleansing happening to where Kurds and Serbians and Muslims were literally killing each other when they were living in the same villages for years under Marshal Tito when it was Yugoslavia.
Yeah, and it does really suck that we're still having this conversation again 30 years later, and really things haven't improved drastically, because, the same problems in the 90s we're still facing today, and I think it just shows how important that media can be and how universal Deep Space Nine is. As unfortunate as it is, there's a lot we can learn from it because these writers are directly referencing real-life historical things. And now, I do want to emphasize, they're not specifically referencing any single one, of course, but they are really emphasizing that they've pulled from a lot of things. And really, no metaphor is perfect. It's the one issue that we have with metaphor things, such as what a lot of Star Trek does, is that nothing's going to be perfect. There's some episodes where it's very obvious they pulled from one thing or another. We're just choosing to focus on kind of one topic today for the sake of this video. That basically leads into our discussion regarding the attacks against Palestinians. And starting with the most obvious parallel, the Cardassians came to Bajor and proceeded to occupy the planet, and then that 50-year occupation ended just before the start of Deep Space Nine. So I know that we're probably going to want a little bit of real-world history as well. Looks at Eric.
Well, the interesting thing about the Levant is I like to call it the area of the dumpster fire. And I hate to really call it that, but since ancient times, it has been one tribe literally going to another tribe and taking over that land. And I'm going to go back to, say, 3000 BC. We are dealing with the Canaanite tribes, Semitic tribes that were living within the Levant. And when I say Levant, of course I'm speaking of what we consider now modern-day Palestine, modern-day Israel. The Levant is just what we would use within academia to explain that area. During that time, even before the time of the Jewish tribes, even before the time of Abram of Uruk, who would become the patriarch of the Jewish nations and take on the name of Abraham, and his wife would take on the name of Sarah under the eternal covenant, as the Jews claim it to be. We also look into where the division happened between the Semitic peoples when you had the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac. They divided when the time came that Abraham and his wife Sarah said, your concubine and his son over there is causing some troubles for us, and I don't want him to have the birthright. The birthright should be with my son. Therefore, Abraham gave him some water, gave him some food, and sent him on his way. And as it says within the Tanakh, and as other people call it, the Hebrew Bible, or even if you want to go into it, the Christian Bible, or even into the Quran, it speaks that Ishmael became the father of a great nation. And that great nation became the Bedouins, or as they were commonly known eventually as the Arab peoples. as they were named basically by the European powers. Now, as for the Semitic peoples, the people of Isaac, that went over into the children of Jacob. And then, of course, a great division happened after all of the people were saved by Joseph and brought into the land of Egypt, and they brought forth the 10 tribes. And of course, I could go on and on with all of the biblical stories, but eventually, the time came that the people were led out of Egypt by Moses and Joshua, and they were brought into the land after being in Sinai for 20 years. They were brought into the land of the Levant. And, of course, being the good colonialistic people that they were, they went from city to city to city and wiped them out. When you hear the arguments that a lot of people have, well, this is our land, I think it was probably best said by a very good Native American friend of mine when he said, the land is not ours to own. It is ours as a gift from the great creator. But of course, with us being human, we love to claim ownership on everything. So historically, I could go into the Philistines. I can go into the Sea Peoples. Literally, it is a freaking baker's list of peoples that went into this land, laid waste to everybody, and of course, they got a little rape and pillage going on over and over and over again, up until finally, one of the worst, most horrible things happened. The rise of the Third Reich. All of the Jews in Europe, in Spain, in Italy, all over the Slavic nations, and even into Russia, were herded into concentration camps. And a horrible injustice happened, where all of these Jews were systematically murdered and disposed of. They had to do something about it. And at that time, of course, Palestine was under the control of the United Kingdom, and there was a decision that was made. We will give this land to what is left of the Jewish peoples. Now, was that a good thing that happened? Was it a bad thing that happened? I'm not going to make that decision because that's not my place. But they were given this land. And of course, the moment they were given this land, all of the Arab nations around them said, oh no, this isn't going to happen. And they invaded. And Israel held them off. And they took the Gaza Strip. Then they took the Golani Heights, and eventually they took the whole of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. But of course, eventually something happened. Something that many of the Jewish peoples, me myself included, do not like, and that was the rise of something called Zionism. The idea that all of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and everyone else that is there does not deserve it. Of course, when they say it belongs to the Jewish people, they're excluding the Christians, they're excluding the Muslims, they're excluding pretty much all of the major faiths that are in that area. We had great steps that happened during the 90s when finally Israel and the PLO met across the table. They shook hands and they developed a two-nation system. But, of course, that Zionism came in, and the people that supported Zionism started to gain traction and started to take over. They took it over, and they started to create Gaza to be almost a prison state. Great walls were developed all around the Gaza Strip. Big towers. They had machine guns and other things put upon it. You would hear people from Ireland were speaking out very loudly about how the Palestinian people were being treated. There were many Holocaust survivors that actually stood up and said that this is no better than how the Jewish people were treated during the Holocaust. Of course, I could go on and on about this, and it's neither here nor there, but it's really good to basically see that historically, whoever for some reason takes over the Levant has this idea that it is their land. It's their land, period, and that's just how it's going to be. Of course, we know from experience, we know from history that once you get those imperialistic ideals, And once you get those extremely nationalistic pushed forward by the government, that, of course, the minorities in the area are always going to suffer.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, too, that you did touch on, because I was trying not to interrupt, but I was going to mention, the irony about the situation is that, we just heard from the writers that they also referenced the Jews in the 1940s as part of the groups they were referencing for the Bajorans. And, it's obviously not the Jewish people. It's Israel's government, which it's always important to make that distinction. It's just the irony that these are people from the same group that did go through that, and now they expect the world kind of just to be okay with the fact that they're doing similar to a different group.
I think it's almost a disconnect.
Yeah.
Because these are the children of the survivors that are there. They have not had to deal with the horrors that their parents had to deal with. That these Jewish people that had to escape out of Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, and other concentration camps, they came to Israel with a hope for peace, a hope that they can raise their children without the fear that it would happen again. There is one thing that is always said amongst the Jewish community. Whenever we remember the Holocaust, we say, never again to anyone, regardless if they're Jewish, regardless if whatever creed, color, religion, sexual preference, never again.
Well, I think some people might have missed the memo that it was applicable to everyone. So getting back on track a little bit to our Deep Space Nine portion of the discussion and why this is a show you should watch if you have not, or, maybe watch it again. We want to talk a little bit about the Cardassian forces and the ways that they kind of brutalized the ways that they brutalized and attempted to subjugate the Bajoran people. I know Joe has some thoughts for us specifically on this.
Well, I had an opportunity to review some of the episodes, and one episode in particular that I thought was very effective, and it was pretty dark, quite frankly. And get this title. The title of it is Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night. It's Season 6, Episode 17. Make it a point to watch that. And in this episode, Kira Nerys goes back, with the use of one of the orbs, goes back in time, and she sees the condition that her mother and her father were dealing with during that time. She, of course, was a little girl at the time. And some of the things that she faced, and the biggest issue was comfort women. The Cardassians took the Bajoran women who wanted to participate, and they essentially made them comfort women. And of course, that's very similar to some ugly points of Asia during the World War II era. But some of the things that they showed in that episode is that they showed how they controlled the Bajorans. The standard family Bajorans, just the average people, average families. They did it with food control. And that's nothing new. You see that happen in history. That's how they controlled them is through food. And the Bajorans fought with each other over the food. So, that was pretty ugly. And another thing that happened that was it was just as heinous is that, some Bajorans chose as their survival mechanism, they wanted to be the overseers, or they would help the Cardassians keep everybody under control. Overseers. So if you watch that and you don't think about the Gaza Strip, you are not understanding what's going on in the world, and I know you guys will understand that. So, but anyway, so the food control issue. Emily had a great point. Emily, can you expound on that? The food control.
Oh yeah. Well, all these aids that people have been trying to give to Palestinians, different fundraisers, different groups, just trying to get food, medical supplies, even doctors into the Gaza Strip to help the Palestinian people. It is very difficult. It'll be, blocked, and the safe zones keep being moved as well. And so it's hard to know where can we even set the aid up. Or by giving aid, are we just creating a bigger target for Israel to then, hit? It's definitely a tactic that Israel's using today.
Yeah, and it's just, I feel kind of bad that I didn't think about this more in the past because I wasn't fully educated. Because there is a lot of, and I don't want to go too much into this because this is another complicated topic, but there is a lot of Christian Zionism as well that, of course, we could talk about all day. And
it's a really hot button topic, especially amongst the evangelical community here in the United States.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was going to say, as someone who was raised Mormon, I witnessed Zionism, not really knowing the term for it at that time, but that was a lot of what I had witnessed, and because of that, I kind of might have known in the back of my head, like, this seems a little bit wrong, like, why are we villainizing an entire group of people? That seems wrong. Basically, it's not too late to try to educate yourself, because I really think that that's going to be, and we'll touch more on this later, but I really think that's going to be the thing that really makes the difference this time, is people actually learning and being willing to learn. If Star Trek is the thing that makes you actually think about this, great. We talked about the things that the Cardassians had done, and I want to touch on how the occupation was ended, because I think this is one of the things that really makes it the reason why Deep Space Nine would have not been made in 2024 today. And that is the Bajoran resistance forces, which are, as much as people don't want to say it, the Bajoran resistance forces employed terrorism to get what they wanted, and ultimately that is the reason the occupation ended. I mean, there were some pressures as well, but it's because of the resistance put forth by the Bajoran people.
But some people's terrorism is other people's military exercises. Coming from a military background, we, as a military, will employ things that some people will consider as terroristic. But again, to the victors goes what you can call it. If you're the people winning, you could say, this person's doing terrorism over here, but we're doing just basically the same thing.
Well, the cliche is one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that's what Kira Nerys, she was confronted in one episode about how she killed innocents and how she killed people that were not soldiers. And she said, but they were there and they were with the soldiers and they were supporting the soldiers. And that was her justification for bombing them or killing them, or they don't get into detail how she did it. But that's something that we need to understand, is that, the folks that support Hamas, they're not, for those supporters, they're not terrorists, they're freedom fighters. Mm-hmm. And as to whether they achieve their goal remains to be seen, probably not, who knows. But that's what we need to make sure we understand with terrorism. And, it's something, terrorism is a form of asymmetrical warfare. And that means, they only have AK-47s and they only have RPGs. So that's all and then they're going to take those and they're going to wage war with it. Whereas Israel has F-35s and they have F-15s and they have blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And we can just, rattle off names of weapon systems until we go white in the face. That terrorism issue is, you have to make your point somehow. And that's what Kira Nerys basically says in many episodes. You can watch all 7 seasons and you'll see her mention that throughout. Because that's her being. That's her whole person, who she is. And it's unfortunate that she had to take that path, but it was forced upon her, and she embraced it, and she, she freed her society.
What makes Deep Space Nine basically unable to be made today? And we talked about how 9/11 was a reason for that, because it doesn't actually universally condemn terrorism, which I think is really interesting, because it doesn't say, oh, this is always the way to get what you want, but it doesn't universally say, hey, this is a terrible thing that everybody did and everybody who did it is terrible, because I think that that's how the narrative shifts in reality. There's things that lead up to this. It's not just the majority of the people involved here. You don't get a resistance group just by one day someone says, hey, we should just do this for no reason. It's because it adds up over time of all these heinous things that happen to, to one group, and it's like, you got to do something about it. And when talking doesn't always work. Not everybody listens to talking. I mean, it didn't work with the Cardassians, and it's not really working now.
There's actually a really good example for this when we talk about terroristic things. If we go back to World War II, we can talk about probably one of the greatest horrible things that the United States did, and that was a fired bombing of Dresden. They literally burned a whole city to the ground with the civilian population in it. But we never talk about what happened at Dresden. it has been swept under the rug because we were the victors. So that was a military action that had to be done. And we can even go into the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was it necessary? The parallels are there, definitely.
Yeah. And you know, the thing that you said about the victors writing history, we've, you know, proven that that's a thing. Because, you know, yeah, the line between these things are really thin, and it's like, what makes it okay for one group to do it? Because oftentimes the government militaries are celebrated for these actions, whereas the freedom fighters are somehow wrong for that. But really, they're both perpetuating violence, and it's very interesting because to me it's like, I don't agree with any violence, but I also understand why some of it happens. And, you know, there's an inequality here that is a huge issue. And it's the same thing that we saw in Deep Space Nine with the Bajorans. It's just, I think the hardest thing for people to accept in a lot of Star Trek circles is that, yeah, Major Kira would basically be the Bajoran equivalent of Hamas. Now, maybe not, you know, it's not a perfect metaphor, but, you know, if she was in that situation, what would she be doing? She might not have the same kind of rhetoric and stuff, but she kind of did, because there was that episode where she had to come to terms with the fact that she was a little bit prejudiced to every Cardassian because of what had happened to her and what her people had experienced.
Well, and you know, Kira Nerys, you know, I don't think we have to apologize for her. She was in that role of Hamas because she had small weapons, small explosives, and small means of defeating the Cardassians. And ultimately, the Cardassians became jaded and they left. And, you know, so they probably weren't, you know, defeated militarily, but Kira Nerys and her cohorts did what it took to get Bajor free again.
There's so much rage bait that happens on the internet regarding Hamas. It's like, every time you post anything about Palestinians and, hey, we need to get these people out, etc., you'll always see somebody in the comments that says, what about Hamas? And it's just like, you know, you can't even engage with that, because it's like, tell me you are so far removed from what is actually happening here that this just did not just happen. Like, there were things leading up to this that led to that attack. And I think that's what people don't think about, is that this didn't start on October 7th.
Well, we can't literally just say that all of the Israelis have clean hands, because just recently in occupied Palestinian territory, there was a march done by young Israelis screaming at the top of their lungs, "Death to the Arabs." So when it comes to war, there is never a right side or a wrong side. There is only the enemy for one side and the enemy for another. And there's always going to be somebody in the middle that has to suffer.
There's a lot of people in the middle suffering. And, you know, they bring it up in Deep Space Nine, too. I can't think of a specific episode reference off the top of my head, but I do think that they do touch on, and maybe Joe can help with this, they do touch on at some point, like, you know, everybody else, you know, people who weren't in a resistance cell and who were just trying to live their lives, but, you know, nobody was exempt from the horrors of the occupation, you know?
Yeah, and I don't think there was any one episode that was dedicated to that, but it was throughout all of them part of the dialogue that was going on. One that comes to my mind is Shakar, season 3, episode 24. He was a leader of the resistance. Then the Cardassians left, and then he settled in. He was a farmer. He wanted to become a farmer, and you know, he wanted to use the machinery that was available to him to start his farm, which was in a very difficult area of Bajor. And the Bajoran leaders of the provisional government wanted to confiscate that equipment from him. So you start to see, you know, after this successful war for the Bajorans, that even within, they start fighting with each other. And they say, hey, we need that machine. Well, I've got the machine and I'm using the machine, but we need it. And, you know, there were arguments from both sides that were valid. I mean, Shakar, he had it and he was using it at that time. And then you had Kai Wynn, who came in and said, well, we need it for this area so that we can start exporting food and agricultural products. And so, you know, who's right and who's wrong? You know, is the lone farmer not to be, you know, helped and considered? And of course, Kai Wynn had a point too. I mean, we don't like her, but she had a point. So we need to get a lot of crops going. So, and there are a lot of episodes where you're seeing Bajorans fighting with each other like that. And that's what's so great about DS9 is that it talks about real problems. It really does. It talks about real ugly problems and how they went through it. Some people just barely survived it. Other people, became superstars. So I guess this whole video, whatever we're talking about, we want you guys to watch it. It's a great series.
Well, it's, Kai Wynn is another example of, a broken clock is right twice a day sometimes. Because it's not like every single thing she does, that she did was bad. Just a lot of it was really questionable.
Yeah.
But
bringing up Kai Wynn, because I do think Kira and Kai Wynn actually have a few conversations about, Kai Wynn's like, well, maybe I wasn't, in my resistance cell. Maybe I wasn't actively, participating or fighting. But the occupation was still terrible for me too. So as much as we don't like her, I think she is actually a good example of war hurts everybody involved. Even if you're not actively fighting, you are still suffering. You're still caught in this. So.
Well, she was definitely still a victim. It doesn't excuse what she did, but this is why I says it's just so good. I just every time I think of it, pretty much every character in Deep Space Nine is so layered, and it's just you get depth in a lot of different Star Trek series, but Deep Space Nine was just on a different level. I want to move on to our next point here, and this is another thing that could be an hour-long video in itself, but there's also the issue of the cultural genocide that was perpetuated by the Cardassians and is being perpetuated by Israel right now because indiscriminate bombing, it's destroying a lot of stuff as well.
Basically, you're looking at a whole bunch of people taking their hands, dipping them in a whole bunch of cow blood, and saying, "Look, my hands aren't as dirty as yours." Basically,
that
okay?
Is such a cursed analogy.
But I mean,
it's not wrong. It's not wrong. But and that's the thing is, it's like you really do have to support the people caught in the middle. We're going back to Kai Wynn, unfortunately. I know, she keeps coming up. A lot of Bajorans were prevented from practicing their religion and could be arrested for it. At one point, Kai Wynn was detained for preaching. There's also the environmental impact, which I think is also very relevant to what is happening in Gaza. It specifically mentioned that Cardassians strip mined the planet, so they're just going through and they're chopping away at things and just devastating the whole planet without thinking of it, because to them, the land is just to be used up. I don't think everybody's considering how much the devastation in Gaza is going to affect the environment long term, because if you look at it from space, it looks completely different now than it did.
It's been bombed so bad from the estimates that I've heard. Just to get just basic infrastructure back in the Gaza Strip to where the people could actually have running water, proper sewage, and electricity, we're looking at 15 to 20 years of constant work to get it back to where it was because of the indiscriminate use of bombing and use of targeted missiles. They have destroyed almost every major hospital in Gaza. They have destroyed almost every major school. There is no housing left in Gaza. If you were to go and look at Gaza now, it looks like a moonscape. Whenever you wage total war, and probably a great parallel to that is looking at Berlin after the end of World War II. Berlin was literally turned into a moonscape, and the Germans suffered. They starved.
Well, that's an excellent point. And had we not started to feed the Germans and the Japanese on the other side of the world with the Marshall Plan, they would have turned into a belligerent country or a belligerent people. And that's one of the things we need to understand about Gaza. Poor little Gaza. No real resources to speak of, but I checked today, the last count that I have is 70,000 tons of explosives have been dropped in that little area. And that's insane. And
it's not big.
Yeah, it's not. And but the Israelis' willingness to expend their ordnance, that's just insane. It's stupid. It's not very smart.
We didn't use that much in Baghdad.
Yeah, but the interesting thing of cultural genocide, and I want to talk about the orbs.
Yes.
The Bajorans were very spiritual people. The Cardassians knew how to get under their skin, and that was to take the orbs away from them, and they took many of them away. From what I understand, based upon our beloved Lower Decks animated series, there were 10 orbs, and these were important objects. Like the for the Jews, it would have been like the Ark of the Covenant, 10 of them for the Bajorans, and the Cardassians. They separated them all out. They did things with them. They studied them. They sold them. They did all kinds of stuff. As a matter of fact, after the war, when the Bajorans were starting to collect them back in and people were starting to surrender them back to them, one of them came from the Ferengi. Of all the people, it came from the Ferengi, the greediest people in the Alpha Quadrant. But we love them because DS9 addresses them great and makes them such interesting characters. But anyway, so cultural genocide, that the Cardassians, they did it and they were effective with it, and it hurt the Bajorans, but it also enraged the Bajorans, and that's what made them say, we're gonna win and we're not gonna settle for losing.
Yeah, I think that it is important to note that, and I have to say this as a person who's not religious myself anymore, I do think that the Bajorans, the Bajoran religion is an important element of that as well, because they had passion about something, and, I would see that as a good thing. Again, I'm saying that as a non-religious person. I think the Bajorans having a religion and being passionate about it is really great, and I think that it helped give them the hope that inspired them to actually fight back against their oppressors.
And speaking from a strictly religious point, that is what religion is for. Religion is to instill hope and to instill just the ability to look forward to the future with your eyes looking for something greater than what you've been dealt. I have a Baba who was in Auschwitz. A horrible situation. She was basically taken by one of the German officers as his toy. I'm just going to say his toy because I'm not going to go into the situation.
Yeah, we get it.
Her faith, her belief that the Mashiach one day would come and would help the people, that the Jewish people would be freed one day, is what gave her the ability to survive after her mother was murdered, her father was murdered. She watched as her little baby brother was thrown against a wall and murdered. She had the hope that was given by that faith, just like all religions have. In Palestine now, a lot of the Muslim people are holding on to that faith. That is what's keeping them going. And I think that was a great point that you brought up. That you get a gold star.
I think the main thing when it comes to the culture is just the dehumanization, that you see with the Cardassians and in the real world as well. Because at best, they're, the Bajorans are compared to children. And most Cardassians seem to think of them as just nothing more than animals. And even the Cardassians, that think of the Bajorans as these misguided, children that just don't know any better, they expect the Bajorans to then respect them, because it's like, hey, I don't have the worst opinion of you that I could possibly have, so therefore I must be this gold star. That's Gul Dukat's whole deal. Is, why am I not getting a gold star for not being as terrible as I could have been?
How about we talk about, say, the way that when we went ahead and started to occupy Japan and we started to occupy Germany, the United States basically treated the German people and the Japanese people, you're little bad children, you need to go back to your corners, you need to do what we tell you, because that is what we want you to do. That was the thought pattern that was put forward at that time.
Well, yeah, it's basically they won compliance for money, basically. Mm-hmm. They told them, okay, you want a car, you want to make a Toyota, you want to make at the time Datsun, you want to start your economy again. Well, we got money for that, but you're going to have to toe the line. And the Japanese, with their Bushido, because they were conquered by the United States, so they deferred to them. They were rather polite about that. The Germans were a little bit different, but they too saw the validity of the Marshall Plan. Okay, we want this money, and that's what it took to rebuild these countries. And it was possibly condescending, but it was for their betterment. And and today both of these countries are some of the richest, anywhere.
Bouncing off of the point that Emily originally said about the kind of infantilization thing that was going on, that happens with a lot of minority groups, is like infantilization is a tool of oppression, especially in, the disabled community. That's one we talk about a lot. And I think that it is very often overlooked as a point, of oppression because, there's the focus on the really bad stuff. It's just really bad, but it's like, it starts and it's like, it kind of descends into like this iceberg of thing. It's like, you start up here, but when you get down here, it's like, there's only a few steps between that and like, cultural genocide at best, and then, actual genocide, all the other kinds of genocide. And I think people just don't realize how thin that line can be.
The best way to control is to dehumanize. It's always about, if you can take a group of people, minority, and remove their humanity to where they are less than you, it is easier to do horrendous human rights violations without feeling any type of remorse or even any type of need to rectify your actions.
And it's not just it's not just on the oppressors as well. I think it also goes into like the propaganda to try to get people on their side. The people, again, who are kind of in the middle, but they're trying to get these people on their side to enable them, even if they don't have the means to directly enable, but they are, vocally enabling. One of the big things that is an issue right now with what's going on in Gaza is the amount of propaganda, because Israel is a propaganda machine.
Oh, they have the money.
Yeah, and and actually, it's interesting we bring up money, because the next point was actually the taking advantage of, times of war in general. War is a business, and that's a huge issue. There were a lot of, smugglers that kind of popped up, and certain Ferengi who were profiting off of the occupation and using it to their benefit, even though they didn't really have a stake in it. They're on the outside a little bit more. They're not really having a vested interest in it, except for what they can get from it.
I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also I have a very, very close connection with what's happening in Israel due to family that lives in Tel Aviv and other things. And I'm going to be straight and honest. The people that are profiting the most right now are companies such as Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Smith & Wesson, all of these arms companies. And it's probably one of the biggest things the United States has. And it's our military industrial complex. Israel is one of the biggest purchasers of American arms in the world. And all of these arms are being used to massive effects in Gaza. And that's something people have to understand. The United States' hands are not clean right now. It is our weapons that are being produced here that we are selling to the Israeli state under Benjamin Netanyahu, who we got, and I'm going to remind people, has been declared as a war criminal.
And yet there's some Zionists in America that still think somehow we're not doing enough to help Israel. It's such a genuinely messed up situation at times that it's appalling to think about. And that's why I wanted to make this video, because it does make me very upset. But it doesn't mean we should stop talking about it. We should still be advocating for that. And it's just kind of funny also, because I didn't even mean to make this point, but you kind of made the point for me that, yeah, the Ferengi are literally America's ruling class. They literally are.
I think that the best way to explain the military-industrial complex is that the Americans believe in a prophet. The Bajorans believe in a prophet, but the Americans believe in a different type of prophet. The almighty American dollar. That's what they want. And that's what they're going to get. And if they can propagate armed conflicts, and this is something that I am very passionate about. I have lost many friends to foreign wars that, of course, we saber rattle, we beat our chests, we're going to show what America can do. But then we never ever think about the cost. And of course, this is just a small thing because it's something that all people need to realize. The cost doesn't end at the battlefield. When we come home, we bring the war home with us. 22 veterans a day are committing suicide, or unaliving themselves, as I should say.
We can say it.
Because of what they've seen and what they've had to do for the American military-industrial complex. And I'm just going to say it out loud. I have lost over 45 friends to suicide because of what they've seen and what they've had to do. And most of these people, you have to understand, when they go, they are young. We are very young. We are going in order to get better lives. We're going into, we believe we're going to get college. We're going to do great things. We do it because of our patriotism. But then we go across into country, we see the things that we see, and we can never get rid of them. And of course, this is a very important subject for me. And I think that it's something that people have to understand. And I think it's a great way to bring in Kira Nerys and what she had to deal with. Imagine being as young as she was and having to take life, even lives of your own people, for a cause that you believed in, and then having to deal with the repercussions. And of course, we can take that right over to the Cardassian side, because not all Cardassians were evil. They had to deal with the repercussions of what they did. I even believe that Gul Dukat had to deal with the repercussions of what he had done. So war, again, everyone loses in war.
Yeah, Gul Dukat ultimately, I think that another thing is, like, he didn't really have a real redemption arc, you know? Like, they kind of, like, started him on one. He is so deeply messed up as a person, you know? Like, you know, but he's kind of the special case. Like, there's a reason we kept seeing him all the time, because he just couldn't let go of anything. He had to always convince himself that he was always right. Like, he could not deal with the fact that he might have done something wrong or bad.
Well, what's appropriate about what you just said about Gul Dukat, excuse me, it's getting late. His episode that we're referring to right now is called Waltz. Of all things to be called, a dance. And that's season 6, episode 11. And he's essentially stranded with Captain Sisko. And Sisko's hurt, and Dukat is having mental PTSDs to the point where he's having hallucinations. And you start to see how involved he was with control of Bajor, and you start to see how his mistakes, his daughter, Ciel dying, getting shot, and so you start to see him go through that whole process of trying to cope with it. Now, Kira Nerys, her episode, which was fantastic, actually came in the first season, and it's called Duet. Another musical kind of reference, right? But it was about war criminals, and this Cardassian comes to the station, DS9, and she swears that he's a war criminal, and she tries to pin that on him. He denies and denies and denies, and goes through this whole circle talk thing. And the interesting thing about Kira Nerys is in the last 30 seconds of the episode, you see her distraught and almost crying over a dead Cardassian. And that's, quite frankly, we can sit here and talk about the Middle East until we're blue in the face. We have to get to the point where we become Kira Nerys, where we can stand over a Cardassian or lean over or kneel over a Cardassian and basically mourn the passing of that person. And the reason, and she explains why she mourns about it, is because he was the hope of the Cardassian future. He was going to be the good guy to go back and change those peoples. As to whether he could have pulled that off or not, we don't know, because he dies. One last thing I'd like to talk about, again, is that, we've been talking a lot about the Middle East and Hamas and 10,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago. And that it turns into this great big giant circle talk, circle conversation about whose fault it is, who owns the land, and that happened in 7 years of DS9 with the Bajorans and the Cardassians. And the one episode, another dark episode, The Darkness and the Light. And in the last 20 minutes of that show, you see Kieran Reese arguing with a Cardassian who's been defaced. And he wasn't even a combatant. He was there to help do the laundry and be a butler. And they get into this argument with each other, and it's almost like they're talking to themselves. Kieran Reese says, well, I was a soldier, and I was a freedom fighter. And the other guy, the Cardassian, says, well, I was a butler, and I took care of people. And I kept clean clothes for the officers and things like that. And that the episode ends where, of course, Kieran Reese gets rescued and they take off and the Cardassian is killed. We have to find a point in any conflict, including ones that are thousands of years old. We have to say, okay, when is enough? And when do we stop? That's what's so fascinating about what's happening and what the television wants to show us. And, if you want to watch some good serious television, DS9 is the way to go. And you'll see real development of individuals, of a people, of the whole spectrum, and it's very fascinating.
I wanted to bring up something about Duet as well, because that is one I actually did have time to rewatch before this, just in passing, and then I got on a train of, I was like, wow, wait, Garrick, he's so interesting too, and then it was all over, and I was like, well, I'm no longer doing research. You brought up Duet, so I wanted to kind of touch on that, because another important part of that episode that you didn't really touch on is, the fact that this is someone who did feel guilt, despite his role not being, a major one. Like, he wasn't the one committing the atrocities. He was just there. He was the file clerk. But he felt like he needed to kind of be held accountable for that, because really, season 1, no one was really being held accountable at that point. He went through huge lengths to try to make sure someone was held accountable. And, that was him, but because he felt something, unlike, Ducat, who really just dissociated himself from that. He was really in it. He wanted to do something, and that's the thing is, similar conclusion, but I just wanted to bring that up as well, for either those who haven't seen it quite yet or missed that part. I don't think you missed that part, but some might have.
There's a lot of parts.
There's a lot of parts to the episode. It's just, there's parts to every episode. It's why we're like 2 hours into this and we're still we haven't even really scratched the surface. We've done the frosting of the cake.
That's one of the things that I really like about Deep Space Nine is even the worst villains have at least a humanizing episode, a humanizing scene. And that is something that I think is so important, because it's important to know that it's not just some random monster that will commit these atrocities. These are people. Mm-hmm. These are people that have gone through a process. It's important to recognize that if you fall into certain patterns of thought, you are just as capable as the people that are actually doing the atrocities. If you fall down the right thought patterns, the right track, if you start dehumanizing people that are different than you, you are just as capable as Gul Dukat.
We saw that very much, especially during my second tour in Iraq. I actually started to find myself no longer seeing the faces of the people, but just seeing another combatant. Because you just get into this situation, and it was kind of cathartic when I actually sat down and I started to watch Deep Space Nine again. And Kieran Reese is dealing with her demons, and I'm like, wait a second, I know how that feels. I know what's going on in her mind.
And I think another thing too that I meant to bring up before when you said it is that I could be wrong, but I seem to recall Kira's only 26 at the beginning of season 1. She's really young. I don't think I really realized that, because I watched Deep Space Nine for the first time I was 12 maybe, and I did not understand the nuances of Deep Space Nine at all at that time. I think that's worth bringing up as well, because I was like, well, I'm 25 now. That's really I'm not that much younger than Kira was, and she had already gone through all of this. And, she started when she was 12 or 14 or something like that, some really young age. And so she's been doing this for over 10 years, and that's just been her life. It's it is something that, I've realized as I've gotten close to that age, I'm like, that is so much too. No wonder she's angry and stuff. There's a reason behind that.
That's why when you see your veteran come home and people are like, well, why is he that way? Or why is she that way? Just remember that most veterans that served in Iraq and Afghanistan, when they were there, were between the ages of 18 to 25. They were literally children, and they had to experience things that most people would never, ever imagine. It's a good way for people to kind of realize, when you see people and you're like, oh wow, why is that guy standing on the side of the road begging for change, saying he's a homeless veteran? Well, maybe because he saw too much.
Well, and it's, we could go into a whole thing on this topic specifically. I mean, we might need another video just for this, because I do think it's a thing, talking about the American military industrial complex. The U.S. military does kind of prey on younger people, 17, 18, and then also, like, afterwards, doesn't always take care of the veterans. They, they're useful, as they're soldiers, but they don't continue that, and they don't keep the same energy. It's like, oh yeah, they're really valuable, they're really doing things for the country, but where's that energy when they're homeless because they have PTSD and other issues and can't do anything else?
Every 4 years, we're known. Every 4 years when there's an election, they're going to come up and kiss the veteran, but then they'll go ahead and put them back inside the box and let them stew for a while until the next election happens. And
it's really a holding the government accountable thing for this. As average citizens, we can be nicer to people, but it's like that only goes so far. So we've kind of finally gotten to the point that I wanted to wrap this video up on, and kind of the main reason I made this video and why it was so important to me that it was made. And sometimes it does feel hopeless, but sitting there and stewing in hopelessness doesn't do anything to help anybody. And if we can't help ourselves and we can't speak up and stand for our rights, then how are we supposed to help the people of Palestine or, around the world and the other genocides that are happening due to the American military industrial complex and many other things, the almighty daughter, the almighty dollar. I can't say words today, but you said that, and it's funny too, because the Ferengi are simultaneously like a parody of America and also somehow like the truth. This kind of goes back to Next Generation. I don't think this is really touched on as much in Deep Space Nine. It is a little bit at the beginning. The occupation went on for 50 years, and the Federation was aware of it, but it was largely just ignored by these other large galactic powers because the Federation considered it a prime directive violation to get involved. But, it is interesting to kind of think about, if more people really knew the facts and knew the details of what was going on, you have to wonder if that kind of outside pressure could have helped end the occupation sooner. Because while it was mainly credited to the Bajoran resistance, there is a little bit of that, had someone said something, because oftentimes in Star Trek, the Federation is considered a metaphor for America in some ways, but also what the U.S. could be if it wasn't like the Ferengi. I know that sometimes they try to represent the U.S. and sometimes it just doesn't work because it's an idealized version of America that doesn't really exist. Because I personally feel like had they, made this more of an issue, if the average person knew about this, if Starfleet officers cared about it enough and, spoke on it enough, would that have made a difference? I would say yes.
I believe that we did see that happen. It's when all of the youth during the 1960s and the 1970s stood up and said, we don't want to fight this war in Vietnam anymore. You had people burning their draft cards. And for the first time ever, the military-industrial complex was brought to its knees, and they had to withdraw the troops. And we got out of a costly, bloody war that literally left a whole generation scarred.
What Eric just said are great points, and it was a complicated, ugly time. I grew up in it. I was actually stationed in Japan during the Vietnam War. Not as a soldier, I was a dependent. It's unfortunate the way it panned out, all those lives lost. And when we talk about 55,000 Americans being killed, they don't even know how many Vietnamese were killed, and they think it's over 2 million people.
Let's not forget about Agent Orange or the cluster bombs or anything else that was used.
Yeah, and I guess we could keep going on, but I guess the only thing I can say about that whole era is it produced some of the greatest music ever. And I don't mean to make light of anything,
No,
but it
for sure.
was the greatest music ever.
Well, and I think we can actually, spin this a little bit positively and say, out of horrible things, like there is still human joy that's created. And that's why I'm so passionate about artwork and stuff, and, not replacing it with generative AI and the like, because there is something so human about creating things, even in the worst and darkest of times. But it's just, and it's also a way to, also spread awareness. I think, creativity can spread awareness for it, because there's so much that you can put into art. We should be putting ourselves out there and expressing ourselves, because it's really, really important. Because if we let the oppressors get us to the point where we are not at all feeling joy, like I think it's a form of, just like, it's a radical act to just love yourself when you are part of a group that, the system does not want to see you succeed.
And probably the one thing that I've always wanted to say when it comes to all of these things, coming from academia, knowledge is power. If you get out there and you research, if you get out there and really look into what's happening in the world, you do the work to figure out what you can do as a person. Just imagine how many lives you can touch. And that means sometimes it's better to open your mouth instead of keeping it shut. Sometimes you have to be the loud voice. I mean, if it wasn't for some of those loud voices, nobody would have known what was happening in those concentration camps. If it wasn't for the loud voices, nobody would have known what was happening in Vietnam, or in Korea, or in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you become ignorant, you're just another cog in the machine.
And it's good to not be quick to, immediately speak over people when you don't have all the facts. But I do think that genuinely in issues like the one we're facing today, it's like it is really important to use your voice, even if, you don't feel like, you can speak on all the nuances. Just saying something at this point to, show your support is really important.
I definitely agree. I do think one thing that's important to know is with the Vietnam War, it was American soldiers that were involved in that conflict. And so when Americans said, stop no more, there was a huge component of that got pulled back. When it comes to, Bajoran and Cardassia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there were Federation troops on the ground in that conflict. And so it becomes the Federation would need to find a way to put pressure on the Cardassians, maybe threatening them with, trade, cutting off certain routes, embargoes. I feel like when it comes to the Federation, the citizens would need to hold their representatives accountable, because it's their representatives that are going to, set up embargoes or enter negotiations. So calling your senators, electing local leaders, really just pay attention to things that you can control.
It's like, my fellow young people, please vote in your local elections. Don't get so hyper-focused on the presidential election that you completely ignore your local leaders, please. They're really important, especially more now. But I did want to point out, though, because I forgot to mention Ro Laren, actually. Because I think that Ro Laren in Next Generation was part of spreading that awareness. Because a lot of Starfleet was completely ignorant. And I don't necessarily think that was by choice. I think that's because the Federation kind of just didn't really care. And that's why the metaphor is not perfect and everything, of course. But, at what point does it become your problem? Because the Cardassians going around and pillaging things does set a bad precedent for, others, especially because, the Federation does, want to help people generally. But then they just decided this one, they're like, it's not our problem. We'll sit this one out for now. And I do think it's not one of the Federation's finest moments, but I do think that we should credit Ro Laren to spreading that awareness within Starfleet. Because without her, I think that there would have been a lot of people wouldn't have had a reason to care.
The greatest thing to watch with Ro Laren in The Next Generation is the argument that she has with Riker about her earring. That's it. She says, I'm Bajoran, and we wear these as a spiritual emblem of what they believe, who they are. And Riker said, well, the regulation book says you can't wear that. And, I'm not going to go into that any further. Watch the episode, and you'll see the spark that lights the Bajorans. And, for my last thing I want to say for tonight is the Bajorans survived everything that was heaped upon them. And I believe that the Palestinians will survive all that's being heaped on them. There are just too many people that are too vested in their religion, their families, the region, that they're not going to go away. And that's why we have to embrace the idea of trying to help them out in one. And I'm not saying dump trillions of dollars in there, although it probably needs it now because they don't have houses anymore. But point being is, that's what the beauty of Star Trek. You can watch Star Trek and you can think about the Palestinians at the same time. And, you know, there are bad guys, there are good guys, but we're not always good guys and we're not always bad guys. And that's what Deep Space Nine does brilliantly with this whole thing. So if you haven't watched it yet, or if it's not your favorite, give it a try. And what you will find is well-rounded stories, well-rounded characters, and a lot of tugging of heartstrings, quite frankly.
Amazing nuance.
Yeah,
so much amazing nuance.
Thinking about it all the time. Okay, but you see, we're at a really good spot to end now. So I do want to take a moment and just say that one way that if you are seeing this video and you would like to help, I would really suggest looking into Operation Olive Branch. They are an organization that really is trying to get aid directly to Palestinian families to try to get them out of Gaza and somewhere else. It's really difficult work, and you know, we're getting to a point where without a ceasefire, they really can't help everybody. But it's a start, and I think that those kind of initiatives are something that we should really all be looking into supporting, because, you know, you might not think that your $5 does much, but it adds up. It adds up because, you know, if 100 people give $5, you can help get somebody out of Gaza. And if we don't have anything else to add, if you stuck around to watch this entire video, I really appreciate you, because I don't know how long it's going to be. It's going to be really long.
But worthwhile.
Leave us a comment if you enjoyed this. You know, any... I hear the haters typing. Feel free to leave your comments below. We would also really appreciate if you gave us some feedback of what you would like us to discuss next. We've discussed covering the Maquis and other concepts, whether from Deep Space Nine or other Star Trek series. We've mostly watched them all and watched them all very deeply and studied them and just
a little bit too much sometimes.
Probably a little bit too much. This is the group to, you know, if you want to see something discussed, just let us know. Be nice to each other. Please don't get any fights in the comments that make me have to delete anybody's contributions. But that's all. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
Thanks, everyone.